anyone who looks at what's happened in Ukraine understands that warfare has changed rather profoundly. Warfare is not going to be dominated by armor on the ground as it once was. What dominates warfare today is something I've been writing about for 30 years off and on, and that is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance linked to strike systems, rocket artillery, missiles, conventional artillery. That's what's dominating the battlefield. That's what's lethal. Now, sometimes it comes in the form of a small handheld weapon system, but most of the damage is really done by much larger, more powerful precision-guided munitions and missiles. The Russians understand this. They were the first to recognize this back in the 1970s. This is now being employed. So if you send armor anywhere without substantial air defense support to try and defeat these missile threats from drones, from terminally guided systems, whatever, you're not going to have tanks for very long. You could watch 88 tanks vaporize in a few minutes. And at the same time, your infantry has to be there in the form of armored fighting vehicles with lots of firepower and, again, lots of overhead protection. Top attack from ISR strike dominates the battlefield now. Precision has made it extremely lethal. And that's why, if you look at the Russians, excuse me, they are moving very deliberately, very slowly, advancing under the umbrella of this ISR strike. They don't have to make any mad dashes to Kiev or across the river to hold something and wait for reinforcements. They have effectively created steamrollers. The steamroller is supported by this top attack system, the ISR strike complex, the overhead surveillance. And it's working very effectively. It's protecting their forces and absolutely devastating the enemy. And then as they need to, they move forward their armored force on the ground and their direct fire capabilities with the infantry and the armor, and they annihilate whatever is left after they've disrupted, disintegrated, atomized, do whatever words you want, the front. That front in southern Ukraine is crumbling. It's falling apart. It's almost completely destroyed at this point. And how many casualties the Ukrainians have had is anybody's guess. I've heard from 157,000 dead up to over 200,000 dead. I've heard 400,000 casualties. I've heard 500,000 casualties. No one is telling the truth in the West. The only way you can find these things out is by talking to people on the ground. Ukrainians, Russians, and Poles are very helpful. And they will tell you the truth. And the American people haven't been told the truth. And they don't understand that we are not in a position to go to war with anyone today. We're not. We don't have munitions factories, armaments factories, turning out equipment 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Russians do. Their factories are humming. There's no shortage of anything. In fact, what they've done recently, according to the most recent reports I've seen, is that they've walked back from some of the major overhead strikes. They have the capacity to fire 60,000 rounds a day, including rockets and missiles at the Ukrainians. 60,000 rounds. But they've been walking that back, and the Ukrainians who are watching this, and the Poles and others are saying the Russians are husbanding these for the coming offensive. And this offensive is coming. There are 700,000 troops all the way around Ukraine. Of that number, probably 250 to 300,000 are combat forces. In other words, the people that actually go forward and kill the enemy. They're going to move. And when they move, this steamroller will go forward as I've described. And they will annihilate what is left. And it doesn't make any difference what you send to the Ukrainians. They can't be trained fast enough. There are not enough of them left anymore that can do anything. If you're starting to drag 16-year-old boys off the street, away from their families, into uniform, what kind of a situation do you think you confront? It's terrible. And it's not necessary. We've done this to the Ukrainians. This nation is almost destroyed. There are between 18 and 22 million Ukrainians left in the territory that Zelensky and his friends in Kyiv control. More than 10 million have left the country. 4 million are Russians living under Russian administration and are quite happy about it in the East. And then you have the casualties. And then you have 2 million that were already in the West working in the EU and Great Britain. And the sum at the beginning was never more than about 37.4 million. So this whole thing is a catastrophe. We're killing the Ukrainian nation. We're killing the Ukrainian state. And this is not something that was inevitable. But we were not willing to consider neutrality for Ukraine.